Let me just introduce Mary and Georgette then. Mary Nodine, you have probably heard before. She presented a couple of months ago. She's a registered professional engineer with GEI Consultants, and her specialties include ground improvement design and geotechnical explorations. And with that, it's no surprise that she is heavily involved in the DFI Committee on Subsurface Characterization, which she also chairs. And she's also the geotechnical poet, and you can find her work in Geostrata. And in the latest issue, she wrote on an investigation method that is near and dear to my heart, the cone penetration test. She'll be supported today by Georgette Hlepas, who is the National Geotechnical Policy Advisor for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She has over 12 years experience in geotechnical engineering, has a Ph.D. in civil and materials engineering from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a master's in engineering from Columbia University in New York. And with that, I think Mary will start us off. Mary, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you, Gerald. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, fantastic. I will say, first of all, that I believe I'm really supporting Georgette on this presentation. I'm really grateful that she's able to share this really interesting information with us. But as Gerald said, I presented in an It's Money presentation a couple of months ago in April, and that presentation was on the on how to save money, how subsurface characterizations can save money on projects. So in that presentation, I actually alluded to the Army Corps program in which they're collecting data on claims related to subsurface characterizations. And Georgette Hlepas from the Army Corps, she's the National Geotechnical Policy Advisor for the Army Corps of Engineers. And in this presentation, she's going to give us a lot more information and detail on how the Army Corps is handling the risk related to subsurface investigation and learning from their own projects. There we go. Oops. So a brief outline, I'm going to give an introduction to the Subsurface Characterization for Deep Foundations Committee of DFI, and I'm going to talk briefly about the subsurface issues and cost implications that we tend to see on geotechnical projects. Georgette is then going to jump in and talk about the Army Corps of Engineers risk management process. She's going to present a specific case study that illustrates this issue really well. So as Gerald said, I'm the chair of the DFI Subsurface Characterization for Deep Foundations Committee. I'm going to give you a couple of key relevant bullets from our mission statement. We aim to educate stakeholders on the benefits of effectively managing ground risk. We aim to promote the value of improved subsurface characterization brings through efficient design, informed constructability, and more economical bids. And we also aim to promote innovative technology, not as a blanket statement, but where appropriate on projects. Ultimately, our focus is on the end users of information from subsurface characterization programs. So a few statistics just to give you the bigger picture of the potential implications of subsurface issues. 80 to 85% of building failures, at least in Europe, are related to ground problems, and 50% of project delays are attributed to adverse ground conditions. And these are some statistics that Georgette found, and she also wanted to point out that between 0.2 and 0.5% of construction costs are typically spent on subsurface investigations. So this is an interesting comparison because it sort of shows us that although not in all cases you need to spend more money on subsurface investigations, in many cases you're underspending on subsurface investigations and you end up with problems that could have been prevented. So Georgette's going to be getting more into how the Army Corps is handling this risk specifically, not just spending more money, but considering whether more money should be spent and what kinds of issues need to be considered. So this slide was shown in my previous presentation, but I think it's really good to kind of bring home this idea of the impacts that subsurface problems can have on projects from a financial standpoint. So this chart is showing the annual magnitude of subsurface change orders for several states. This is from the NCHRP synthesis report. And there was a survey of all US states. This was the only data that they were able to collect, and that's kind of telling because it illustrates how difficult this data actually is to obtain. This does not include cost overruns or claims. It's just the subsurface change orders, and it represents up to 17% of all agency change orders. So this is a pretty big cost item that can be relatively easily addressed with just more information. Qualitatively, even though the authors were not able to get data for all states, most agencies indicated that although they didn't have data on the financial impact of change orders, it was a priority concern. And it's also important to note that although these numbers don't necessarily look that big in the grand scheme of things, or they may not, depending on what your perspective is, the impact to a state agency of several $1 million on one project can be really significant. So the conclusion is that there are major financial consequences when you lack a detailed understanding of the underground, and not much has historically been done to proactively address this issue. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Georgette, and she's going to talk about how the Army Corps is addressing subsurface risk.
All right, thanks, Mary. Just verifying you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so the Corps has a focus on risk-informed decision-making, and that same focus applies to subsurface-related concerns. As Mary pointed out, and in the other slide, there's a lot of issues that come up related to subsurface concerns during construction, and in general, there's a relatively low percentage of the total project cost allocated for geotechnical investigations. Now, in some cases, that low percentage is absolutely appropriate. However, depending on the project type and subsurface complexity, this can be greatly insufficient. So the question is always, well, how do we know what an appropriate amount of subsurface investigation is? Well, the answer is it depends. How much risk do you want to take when it comes to your project? This is where risk management comes in. And when I talk about risk management, I'm referring to a systematic process of identifying, analyzing, and responding to risk throughout the project lifecycle. So this includes everything from the planning phase to the engineering design phase and through construction. This risk management process is meant to facilitate making informed decisions on projects for a variety of aspects, including subsurface investigation efforts. So the figure on this page outlines the risk management process, from identifying the risk through managing potential risks. This cycle starts with the identifying the risk phase, and you can see that highlighted in yellow in the cycle. I want to emphasize that identifying the risk should be done by an experienced geotechnical engineer when it involves geotechnical related risks. But that geotechnical engineer doesn't just identify the risk. They should be part of the process through the entire life cycle, and I'll go through the whole thing. So what kind of geotechnical risks am I talking about? Some examples include unanticipated subsurface materials, like if you encounter rock where you're really expecting soil, or the vice versa, you find soil where you're expecting rock. Unexpected groundwater volumes, encountering unidentified utility of obstructions. And these will all vary depending on the nature of the project, and again, need to be thought out at the beginning of the process early on. So once you've identified what the potential risks is, the probability of occurrence and the associated consequences need to be identified for each risk. So let's discuss these a little bit in more detail. So for estimating the probability of occurrence, I'm showing this probability chart. And this is used to aid in estimating what that probability that risk will occur is based on the information known at the time of the estimate. So the probability, and we'll call it P because there's a surprise, an equation coming up, ranges from very high to very low. An event that has a very high probability of occurrence is associated with a greater than 80% chance that the risk is realized. On the other side of that, the flip side of the coin, a risk with a very low probability of occurrence is one that's so unlikely that it can be assumed not to occur during the project. And this is associated with about a less than 10% probability of occurrence. So descriptions of the probability are included in this table to help facilitate an appropriate estimate. Each probability is also given a scale value. Of course, the highest probability is given at the highest value, which is 5. And then the lowest probability is given a value of 1. So keep these scale values in mind because they're going to play a critical role in a couple slides. So now I'm going to show you a very similar table, but instead of the probability, I'm showing you the consequences of occurrence or the impact that may occur. So as shown in this table, the consequences considered are not only cost impacts, but they also include schedule, safety, and public perception impacts. Just like the previous table, a scale value for each category is considered based on the impact of the consequence. So the example definition of each of these impact categories I'm showing here, ranging from very high to very low, and obviously associated with that scale value 5 to 1, just like the previous table, it's not always appropriate for every project. So a team needs to come to a consensus on what the definition for each of these impacts is. Nonetheless, once it's established, if you're on the very high side or medium or very low, that scale value needs to be obtained. So now you have two scale values, one from probability and one from the impact. So what we want to do is determine the overall risk associated with the project. And this can be done by multiplying the scale value from the probability of recurrence table by the scale value of the consequence table. You're probably wondering, well, I have a lot of different consequences. The idea here is to take the max scale value of each of the consequence categories and use that in the equation. So here I'm showing you a third table, and this is the risk matrix that kind of combines everything together. The purpose of this risk matrix is to prioritize efforts in a risk-informed fashion going forward. So for example, risks that ranked high probability, high consequence, or scale value of 5 on both scales, multiply that together, you end up with a 25. Those are showing up in red, and those are associated with a ranking of severe. And those will be the most critical things that you want to address. These would be given the highest priority, and then you would go on to the next highest priority, the substantial, and then moderate, and so on. Those risks with very low probability, low impact, shown in green, and at the bottom right corner of the matrix, those can typically be ignored because they have a negligible impact on the project. So now you have prioritized your risk, you need to make a decision on, well, how are you going to address the risk? Well, there's a few ways you can do this, and I have listed 4 of them here. One is to mitigate, other is a transfer, another is to avoid, and the last to accept. So mitigation involves taking early steps to reduce the probability or impact of a risk. It often takes resources and time, and so that should be considered. Risk transference requires shifting the risk and the ownership of the response to a third party. I'll discuss a little bit more about risk transfer and mitigation in a minute in my example. Risk avoidance involves changing the project plan to eliminate the risk or to protect the project objective from its impact. And the last option, risk acceptance, may be appropriate when the consequences are severe. And when I say acceptance, it doesn't necessarily mean a lack of action. It could be planning or keeping a preparation of a plan in hand in case that risk is in fact realized. So going back to that risk mitigation, I wanted to take some time and focus on this as it relates to geotechnical concerns. So one of the most prominent ways to mitigate these risks is to perform subsurface investigations and better characterize the subsurface. And as Mary pointed out in her presentation last month, where this data chart was shown, it clearly demonstrates that more resources allocated towards subsurface investigation, shown on the horizontal axis, the lower the cost growth during construction, which is the vertical axis. And this finding holds true with the data points plotted from the Army Corps of Engineers database, and those are shown in red. The one red point with approximate 55% cost growth, I'm going to discuss that a little later in the presentation, and it's part of the case study, but I want to go back to this cost of subsurface investigations and talk about it a little more. So there's a balance on how much is spent on subsurface investigation versus the cost associated with the risk. So as I mentioned before, it takes an experienced geotechnical engineer and typically some baseline data to determine how much subsurface investigation is necessary to mitigate the risk. So the cost of mitigation then needs to be weighed against the risk of failure, and that's where that risk matrix comes in. So for example, one would not spend $1 million on an investigation for a risk that's associated with about a $200,000 cost increase. But I'll note it's not a pure numbers game. Other considerations such as confidence in the cost estimate and the time available to implement the investigation need to be considered. So also related to subsurface investigation is site characterization and the obtained information, ensuring that the information in the contract documents. So this is what I'm going to get into is something that's considered a hot topic in the Corps of Engineers as well as in the geotech industry at large. So in fact, there's a DFI Superpile virtual conference that was held in June with a panel discussion on this very topic. And there are some scheduled follow-up panels planned for the DFI annual virtual conference in October, as well as the IFCEE conference next spring. So there are two basic school of thoughts here. One is to provide a geotechnical data report in the contract documents, and the other is to provide a geotechnical baseline report. So the GDR, or the geotechnical data report, is typically much simpler. It's basically a collection of boring logs and lab results, and there's no data interpretation involved. It's purely the data obtained from the investigation provided in the contract set of documents. So in this case, the risk is transferred to the contractor to understand the data and make their own interpretation for which to base their bids. If this is all that's done, the designer can save cost on the data interpretation, but will likely receive bids based on the contract having to have assumed the risk. In situations where the contract acquisition method is low bid, a more liberal interpretation of the documents may have been made by the awardee, and there is an increased risk of a differing site conditions claim or mod in the end. In the other option, you have the geotechnical baseline report, or sometimes called the GDR, which is really common in the tunneling industry. An interpretation of the geotechnical data is made, and that interpretation is provided as part of the contract documents. The level of detail is typically commensurate with the project risk, but also results in a higher cost during the planning and design phase of the project. So, however, the added detail provided to the prospective bidders plays a role in leveling the playing field by establishing the interpretation. This also plays the role of potentially reducing the costs associated with contingencies in contractors' bids, as they no longer transferred the risk. This can also help reduce claims and cost growth associated with a liberal interpretation of the data report. So now that you've established what the risk is, the likelihood, you've ranked it, you prioritized it, and you've gone ahead to establish how you're going to mitigate or transfer the risk, the last stage is the risk management process is managing the risk. And well, what this is really talking about is, monitoring risk changes over time and how the risk mitigation plans are working, or in some cases are not working. So potential decision points and actions need to be identified as part of the risk management planning. So for example, if you've determined that geotechnical investigations are needed to mitigate the risk, you probably have a decision point after the investigations are completed to determine if that geotechnical hazard risk has increased or decreased. Another part of the managing risk is associated with data management, and this includes recording, maintaining, and reporting the risks, risk analyses, risk mitigation, and tracking all these results. If risks change significantly, the risk management strategy may need to be adjusted. So for example, if the risk is found to have been reduced, other risk mitigation activity resources may be released. If the risk severity increases, additional appropriate risk mitigation allocation efforts may be needed to be developed and implemented. In any case, the rationale for the changes to the risk mitigation strategy need to be documented. And in the end, the proper data management can aid in post-construction evaluation of risks and help to review lessons learned. So I'll note we don't want to discount human error. Many geotechnical concerns have been realized due to human error, and I have a few quotes here for reference that are still applicable today. Now, a lot of the dam failures we see have occurred because of oversights that could have and should have been avoided. A lot of geotechnical failures due to human, organizational, and uncertainty, and deep excavation failures in the Netherlands caused by not applying existing knowledge. So these are a little older in text, but I'm finding with a lot of the reviews that we see, it's a lot of times because just pure human error. So in a related note to human error is the issue of overconfidence. So this chart is from Kruger and Dunning in its 1999 chart, and it indicates as professionals gain knowledge, they grow from a novice to an expert. So early career individuals typically have some ignorance and an overestimation of self-knowledge. However, there should come a point in a person's career where they are actually humbled by their experience and often underestimate their self-knowledge. What this chart does not capture is the perceived experience of individuals due to the length of time in their careers and those persons' overconfidence in their knowledge. An example of this may be a board of consultants in 1958 who recognized that leakage risks resulting from unknown and indeterminate ground conditions were involved in a dam construction projects. However, they believed that the known conditions were sufficiently favorable to justify taking the risk. The end result in this case was a project that was $3.6 million over budget, which is a cost growth of over 100%, and a project that 80 years later still does not serve its intended purpose due to the underestimation of the complex subsurface conditions. So, as a final note related to geotechnical risk management, I have the following quote. Residual risks are unavoidable because ground is the greatest uncertainty in civil engineering. So I promised a case study, and here it is. I present a case of two water control projects. These two projects happen to be relatively close to one another. You got the southern project, which consists of one water control structure, while the north project consists of two control structures. So the southern structure I'll talk about first. It underwent what would be defined as a traditional geotechnical design and analysis. Appropriate site-specific subsurface exploration and characterization was performed. The geotechnical and structural engineers worked out the foundation details based on the subsurface information. They came up with a shallow foundation footing design, and there was a noted need for some dewatering based on the available information, and so mill sumps and water collection trenches were included as part of the design. In this case, the risk associated with poor foundation design and water control measures was mitigated with subsurface investigation, and the result was no cost growth and no time delay. Now the north structures, these were two structures adjacent to each other, shown in the aerial view. Each was similar in size to the southern structure. They weren't in the original contract scope, and a decision was made to add them. So the geotechnical engineers at the time indicated that additional investigation and analysis was needed to ensure the appropriate design was employed. They indicated there was variable subsurface conditions in the area and only one shallow boring to work from. So the management team considered this and thought that due to the proximity of the northern and southern structures, about 600 feet apart, and the existing boring nearby, about 80 feet from the structures, it was not worth the time delay or cost associated with additional investigations and analysis, so therefore the risk was then accepted. Ultimately, a similar design was employed for the northern structures as the southern structure, and during this construction, much larger volumes of water were encountered than anticipated. The watering design was insufficient, and deep wells with high capacity pumps were required. The picture shown on the right is of sand boil at the site during excavation. In addition, the subsurface material was of much lower strength than anticipated, and the foundation design was inappropriate. Instead of shallow foundation footings, a timber pile foundation was required. In the end, a 55% cost growth and a 69-day delay resulted. Had the appropriate subsurface investigations and analysis been performed, the cost of additional equipment and materials and labor to execute the modification could have been avoided. The project personnel indicated that it would have been more cost-effective to have completed the subsurface investigation and have corrected the design prior to construction rather than finding out these issues during construction. So, in summary, subsurface modifications can be costly and time-consuming. Although you can't remove all the geotechnical risk, you can take measures to manage the risk and make risk-informed decisions. These include employing a risk management throughout all phases of the project and employing appropriate level risk mitigation and allocation techniques. Subsurface investigations play a key role in risk-informed decision-making, as do appropriate level geotechnical reports being provided as part of the contract documents. In all phases of the project and design making, an experienced geotechnical engineer should be involved to aid in risk identification, allocation, and management. Before I continue, I did want to mention those interested in this topic, there's going to be an article in the January-February issue of GeoStrata magazine. So if interested, please be sure to be on that lookout. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgette, for a very interesting presentation about how to assess the risk and then how to go deal with that.